Washington woke up to the unexpected death of Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, 71, who changed the course of modern history with his hawkish Iran platform and key role in establishing the stridently conservative U.S. Supreme Court. Donald Trump was one of the first to pay tribute to the controversial South Carolina lawmaker, a close ally despite past
Sunproof twill fight. The iron hinges of the heavy oak doors groaned, a sound that resonated not in the air, but directly against Sarah's teeth. Outside, the world should have been cold. It was late autumn, the air biting, but as they crossed the threshold, the wind died instantly. Not a breeze, not a rustle. The silence was heavy, pressurized. "Keep your eyes on the tree-line," Sarah whispered, her grip tight on Rachel's hand. "If we hit the boundary marker by the old well, we're out. Don't look back at the windows." Rachel nodded, her breathing shallow. She stumbled, her boots catching on an uneven stone. Sarah steadied her, heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. They sprinted, their pace unnatural, blurring through the dying light of the manor's courtyard. But the gravel path, which had looked like a straight shot to the perimeter fence just moments ago, seemed to stretch. The trees, previously spindly and familiar, surged upward. Their branches twisted with audible pops, knitting together overhead like fingers closing into a fist, blocking out the sliver of twilight sky. "Sarah," Rachel choked out, stopping dead. "The well. It's in front of us again." Sarah skidded to a halt. The moss-slicked stones of the well were exactly where they had been 10 minutes ago. She spun around, searching for the gate. Behind them, the house loomed, not as a backdrop, but as an encroaching presence. The windows, dark and vacant a moment ago, were now lit from within by a sickly, rhythmic pulse of amber light, like a lung drawing breath. "It's a trick," Sarah hissed, grabbing a heavy rock from the ground. She hurled it toward where the driveway should have been. It didn't hit earth. It struck a surface with a hollow, metallic clink and fell straight down, vanishing into a flicker of shimmering air that rippled like oil on water. The reality of the estate hadn't just changed, it had folded. "We're still inside," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with a dawning, jagged terror. "Sarah, look at the house." The architecture was warping. The stonework of the facade bled, mortar dripping like bile, rearranging itself into complex, impossible angles. Stairs that led to nowhere sprouted from the side of the walls, and the front door they had just exited was now a window, 20 feet above the ground. "We keep moving," Sarah said, though her voice lacked the conviction of a moment ago. "We don't stop. We don't acknowledge the change. If it's a hallucination, we fight it with focus." They moved, but the landscape rebelled. Every path they took curved back toward the central structure. The geometry of the manor was a loop, a closed circuit designed to break the spirit. The lighting shifted from the natural dimness of dusk to a synthetic, flat white glow that emanated from the very masonry, revealing every crack, every imperfection, and, most disturbingly, every hidden eye. Small, black camera lenses were embedded into the stone carvings of gargoyles and floral reliefs. They tracked them with a soft, mechanical whirring that sounded like insects feeding. "They're watching," Rachel said, pulling her jacket tighter. "David is watching every step." "Let him watch," Sarah snapped, though she felt a cold shiver trace her spine. "He wants us to panic. If we show fear, we feed the contract." They rounded a corner, expecting the back gate, but found themselves standing in a corridor they hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with mirrors, not antique, silvered glass, but modern, high-definition screens disguised as mirrors. Sarah stopped. In the reflection, she didn't see herself. She saw a version of herself from hours ago, terrified and pleading, screaming at a closed door. She saw Rachel sitting on the floor of a room she didn't recognize, weeping into her hands. The image was perfectly rendered, a playback of their most vulnerable moments, looped to play in slow, agonizing succession. "Don't look," Sarah commanded, shielding Rachel's eyes. "It's not real," Rachel whispered, her resolve fracturing. "It's just light and glass. It's just a show." "Exactly. A show." Sarah stared at the reflection of her own face, distorted by the flickering screen. "And we are done performing." She raised her fist and drove it into the center of the mirror. The impact should have shattered the glass. It should have sent shards flying. Instead, her hand met a resistance that felt like hardened gel. The screen didn't break. It rippled, pulling her hand deeper, the surface clinging to her skin like warm, viscous oil. "Sarah!" Rachel screamed, pulling at her arm. The screen pulsed. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated cold surged up Sarah's arm, turning the marrow in her bones to slush. It wasn't just magic, it was an enforcement of geometry. The house pushed back, the walls groaning as they constricted, forcing the hallway to narrow until they were pressed shoulder to shoulder, gasping for air. The amber light from the walls intensified, blindingly bright, and the sound of 1,000 ticking clocks filled the corridor. Tick. 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 Sarah felt the strength drain from her limbs. She tried to lunge forward, but her feet felt as though they were fused to the floorboards. Her vampiric speed, usually a blur of predatory grace, was sluggish, hampered by a heaviness that felt like lead weights tied to her spirit. "It's not just the house," Sarah wheezed, her eyes darting to the ceiling where the shadows were detaching themselves, forming long, spindly fingers of darkness. "It's the name. He knows our names. He has us under lock and key." Rachel fell to her knees, her breath hitching. I can't feel my own pulse, Sarah. It's like it's stopped." Sarah looked down. Rachel's skin was turning the color of porcelain, a waxy, artificial sheen spreading from her fingertips toward her wrists. The house was already beginning the transformation. It was feeding on them, consuming their vitality to power its own impossible existence. "Stay with me," Sarah growled, forcing herself to stand even as her knees buckled. She didn't have the strength to fight the building, but she had the fury to hate it. "Don't let them have you. If you go quiet, you're just another decoration." "I'm tired, Sarah," Rachel whispered, her eyes drifting shut. "It's so loud. The clocks, they won't stop. Ignore them. Look at me." Sarah grabbed Rachel's face, forcing her to make eye contact. "We are Blackwoods. We have survived worse than this." But even as she spoke, the wall to their left groaned and opened, revealing not a room, but a void. A darkness so absolute it seemed to be pulling the very heat from the hallway. And standing at the threshold of that void, silhouetted against the sickening amber light, was the flickering, shifting map of the manor itself, a cage they had never truly left, and one that was now closing its final, jagged gate around them. The iron gate stood before them, a jagged maw of rusted, Victorian-era wrought iron that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic luminescence. It looked like a standard garden boundary, but the air around it tasted of ozone and ancient, rotting silk. Sarah slammed her shoulder into the metal, the force of a vampire's supernatural momentum, usually enough to fold iron like wet parchment. Instead, there was a sickening thrum, a sound like a plucked cello string that vibrated deep in her marrow. She didn't dent the gate. She didn't even rattle it. She simply bounced backward, her boots skidding on the overgrown gravel. Rachel lunged forward, her hands glowing with the latent heat of her vampiric hunger. She grabbed the bars, intending to pull, to warp, to tear. The moment her skin touched the iron, her scream shattered the silence of the woods. "Rachel!" Sarah lunged for her sister, grabbing her waist to yank her away. As Sarah touched Rachel, the sensation hit her like a vacuum. It wasn't just that they were weak, it was as if the manor itself were a siphon. The vitality they usually kept coiled in their limbs, the speed, the lethal grace, the ability to see in the pitch black, was being drained directly into the metal. Sarah felt her pulse thrumming frantically, a frantic, human-like flutter, while her strength evaporated into the gate's cold, hungry geometry. Rachel collapsed to her knees, gasping for air that didn't seem to reach her lungs. Her fingers were scorched, raw, the skin pale and brittle where the fey magic had lashed out. "It's not just a lock," Rachel rasped, her voice thin and reedy. She looked up at the gate, her eyes widening in horror. "Sarah, look." The shadows beneath the gate were not shadows. They were shifting, liquid ink that crawled up the iron bars, weaving into the shape of words. Names. Hundreds of them, flickering in and out of existence like dying embers. Sarah stared at the shifting script. Among the tangle of names, thousands of souls claimed by the manor, she saw their own. Sarah Blackwood. Rachel Blackwood. The letters were etched in a deep, burning violet, glowing with an authoritative, permanent light. "He isn't just holding us," Sarah whispered, the realization settling in her gut like lead. "He's filed us. Like books on a shelf." She tried to push herself up, to force a spark of her nature to the surface, but the effort left her dizzy. The manor groaned, a deep, structural sound of shifting timber and masonry, as if the house itself were drawing a slow, satisfied breath. The trees surrounding them seemed to tilt inward, their branches knitting together to form a canopy so dense it blotted out the moonlight, creating a claustrophobic, sun-proof twilight that felt heavy enough to crush them. "We have to move," Sarah said, though her legs felt like stilts. She grabbed Rachel's arm, hauling her sister up. Rachel's weight was uncharacteristically heavy, her coordination shot by the sudden, brutal dampening of their bloodline's gifts. "It's no use," Rachel sobbed, leaning heavily against Sarah. "Did you feel it? It didn't just stop us. It took a piece of me. I feel empty, Sarah. I feel like there's nothing left inside." "Don't you dare," Sarah snapped, her voice trembling. She scanned the perimeter. The path they had taken was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable, thorn-choked briars that pulsed with the same violet light as the gate. "We are not becoming his curiosities. Not tonight, not ever." Sarah pulled a silver pocket knife from her belt, a small, insignificant thing, and jabbed it into the mossy stone of the nearest pillar. The stone didn't bleed, but it rippled, a deep, bell-like chime ringing through the air. Clang. The sound echoed, expanding until it felt as though the entire forest was singing in response. "They heard that," Rachel whispered, terror tightening her throat. From the shifting, unnatural gloom ahead, a figure emerged. It was not David, but the presence was unmistakable. The queen glided over the uneven ground, her gown of iridescent beetle wings shimmering with a sickly, oil-slick sheen. She didn't walk so much as displace the air around her, appearing closer with every blink of an eye. Her face was a masterpiece of porcelain coldness, her eyes devoid of anything resembling warmth or mercy. She stopped 10 paces away, the very grass beneath her feet wilting and turning to ash. "The architecture of this place is quite specific, is it not?" The queen's voice was like ice cubes clinking in a crystal glass. She didn't look at them as sentient beings. She looked at them as one might inspect a set of cracked china. It was designed for containment. To struggle only causes the architecture to adjust. The more you fight, the tighter the knots grow around your true names. Sarah planted herself in front of Rachel, trying to summon a growl, but it died in her throat, a pathetic, strangled sound. "What do you want?" Sarah demanded, her voice cracking. The queen tilted her head, a slow, predatory movement. "Want? We possess, child. We possess the name, we possess the history, and soon, we shall possess the aesthetic. The collector has been waiting a long time for new centerpieces. You, Sarah, are to be the narrative arc of his season. And you, Rachel." The queen's gaze drifted to the younger sister, who was shivering violently. "You are to be the quietude. The stillness. A doll that never asks, never breathes, and never leaves." "We won't let you," Sarah spat, stepping forward. The queen raised a single, slender finger. Instantly, the ground beneath Sarah's feet surged upward, roots and vines erupting like hungry snakes to coil around her ankles and wrists. Sarah shrieked as the wood hardened into iron-like bindings, pinning her arms to her sides. "The beauty of a contract," the Queen murmured, drifting closer, "is that it does not require your consent. Only your existence. You gave your names away the moment you stepped across the threshold, thinking yourselves clever hunters. You became the prey the moment you opened your mouths to speak. Rachel, run!" Sarah shouted, writhing against the wooden chains. But Rachel was already falling. The same roots surged from the earth, wrapping around her with a terrifying, precise gentleness. She didn't struggle. The lack of vampiric strength had left her too lethargic, her spirit dampened by the sudden loss of her vitality. She slumped into the bindings, her head dropping forward, her eyes glazing over. "There is no running," the Queen said, her voice dropping to a seductive, chilling whisper. "There is only the inventory." She tapped the air, and the fabric of reality began to tear. Portals of shimmering, dark glass opened on either side of the sisters. They weren't doors, they were mirrors that sucked the light out of the air. "Separate them," the Queen commanded. The vines dragged Sarah backward toward the dark, hungry glass. She screamed, her heart hammering against her ribs, but the manor seemed to swallow the sound, dampening it until it was nothing more than a faint, muffled sob. "Rachel." Her sister didn't answer. She was being pulled in the opposite direction, her face slack, her resistance gone. As Sarah reached the precipice of the dark, reflective surface, she caught one final glimpse of the Queen standing in the center of the clearing, a faint, cruel smile playing on her lips. Then, the world folded. Sarah was slammed into a void of absolute, velvet silence. The walls were padded with something that felt like dried, matted hair, and the air was thin, devoid of any scent or sound. She fell to the floor, her limbs still bound, the darkness total. She was no longer in the woods. She was no longer with her sister. She was inside the machine. She lay in the suffocating stillness, the silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. Outside these walls, she knew Rachel was somewhere in the dark, being readied for a fate worse than death. The realization hit her, not as a scream, but as a cold, steady, and terrifyingly clear resolution. If she was to be the star of his show, she would play the part. She would play it until she found the flaw in the stage. She would be the lead, and she would bring the whole theater down around them. Sarah closed her eyes, forcing her pulse to slow, forcing herself to become nothing, no name, no sister, no vampire, just a blade, waiting for the right moment to cut. The iron gate groaned, a sound like grinding teeth, but it refused to yield. Sarah slammed her shoulder into the cold metal again, the force of a vampire's stride doing nothing more than rattling the hinges against stone that felt impossibly dense. Behind her, Rachel was trembling, her hand pressed against the bars. The air in this corridor was thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and dried pressed flowers. It didn't taste like the world outside, it tasted like a memory held too long under glass. "It's not moving, Sarah," Rachel whispered. Her voice was thin, stripped of its usual melodic bite. "Why isn't it moving?" Sarah didn't answer. She couldn't. She could feel the manor breathing, a low, rhythmic vibration beneath her boots that synced with the frantic pounding of her own heart. The geometry of the hallway had shifted while they weren't looking. The door they had just come through was gone, replaced by a seamless stretch of wainscoting that seemed to ripple like skin. "Look," Rachel pointed toward the vaulted ceiling. Where there should have been crown molding, there was a series of glass orbs, each one glowing with a sickly, iridescent light. They pulsed in time with the house. They weren't just lights. They were eyes. "They're watching us," Rachel choked out, backing away from the gate. "They've been watching us since we stepped back inside." "Don't give them the satisfaction," Sarah hissed, though she felt the cold needles of dread prickling at her spine. She reached for her inner reserves, for the predatory speed that had always been her shield, but she found only sludge. Her muscles felt leaden, weighted down by a sudden, crushing exhaustion. It was as if the very air was draining her blood dry, turning her from a predator into a puppet. A sound echoed from the far end of the corridor, the sharp, rhythmic click-clack of heels on polished marble. It was a cold, precise sound, lacking the messy uncertainty of human movement. The shadows at the end of the hall began to coalesce, stretching and twisting like spilled ink until they formed a silhouette. The queen stepped forward into the dim light. She was tall, draped in a gown that looked woven from spiders' silken moonlight. Her face was a masterpiece of porcelain indifference, her eyes glowing with the pale, freezing fire of an ancient, hollow star. "The arithmetic of escape is quite simple, my dears," the queen said. Her voice was like velvet drawn over a jagged blade. She didn't look at them as sentient beings. She looked at them as pieces of inventory that had wandered slightly out of place. One does not walk out of a collection once the curator has decided on your arrangement. Sarah stepped in front of Rachel, baring her fangs, but the effort left her gasping. A wave of vertigo hit her, and she dropped to one knee, her vision swimming with black spots. The manor was feeding on them, drinking their strength to sustain its own architectural cruelty. "What do you want?" Sarah forced the words through gritted teeth. The queen tilted her head, a gesture of mock curiosity. "Want? I want nothing. I am merely the gardener. I prune. I arrange. I ensure that the beautiful things remain beautiful, and the useful things remain silent." She flicked her wrist, and the shadows behind Sarah and Rachel surged forward, thick as tar. "Sarah!" Rachel screamed, grabbing for her sister's hand. Sarah lunged, her fingers brushing Rachel's, but the shadows were faster. They didn't strike like a beast, they enveloped like a shroud. The floor seemed to liquefy, tilting downward, pulling the sisters apart with a force that felt like a physical tearing of their souls. "Don't you dare!" Sarah roared, struggling against the dark tide that was rising up to her chest, pinning her arms to her sides. "The doll maker is waiting for your sister," the queen said, her tone as bored as if she were discussing the weather. "And for you, my pet, the stage is being set. It would be a tragedy to mar your performance with so much unseemly crying." The manor walls began to groan, the stones splitting apart to reveal the dark, hollow maws of individual chambers. These weren't rooms, they were coffins for the living. The sound-dampening magic was already bleeding into the air, silencing the echoes of their struggle. Rachel was dragged toward the cell on the left, her fingernails clawing uselessly at the obsidian floor. She caught Sarah's eye for one final, agonizing second, a look of sheer, paralyzing terror that scorched itself into Sarah's memory. "Rachel!" The sound of Sarah's own voice was swallowed instantly, muffled by the oppressive, absorbent walls of the hallway. The queen walked past them, her elegant train sweeping over the floor, uncaring of the sisters' plight. "The transition is always the most difficult part," the queen remarked, pausing to adjust a brooch at her throat. "But soon, you will find the silence quite comforting." The shadows slammed the doors shut. The click of the locks was final, absolute, and resonant. Sarah threw herself against the door, the impact bruising her shoulder, but the wood didn't budge. It was reinforced with a weight that defied reality. She pounded on it with both fists, calling Rachel's name, but there was no response. Not a thud from behind the neighboring door. Not a sob. The silence was total. It was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that pressed against her eardrums until they hummed. She collapsed, sliding down the door until she hit the floor. The room around her was tiny, cold, and devoid of windows. The only light came from a single, pulsating orb embedded in the ceiling, one of the eyes. She looked up at it, her own face reflected in the curved glass, distorted and feral. She was a hunter, a creature of the night, someone who had survived centuries of shadows. And now, she was a doll in a box, a performer in a show she didn't know how to play, waiting for the curtain to rise on a stage designed to break her. She touched her chest, where her heart beat with a slow, agonizing rhythm. She could feel the manor vibrating around her, consuming their presence, feeding on their despair. She was alone. But as she sat in the suffocating dark, she noticed a faint, rhythmic scratching coming from the wall that connected her cell to the rest of the manor's labyrinth. It wasn't the manor's doing. It was too erratic, too human. Scratch. Scratch. Pause. Scratch. She leaned her ear against the cold stone, her breath catching in her throat. A voice, barely a whisper, drifted through a hairline fracture in the masonry, a voice that sounded like dry leaves skittering over pavement. "Don't scream," the voice murmured. "The walls listen. If you want to keep your mind, you must learn to think in silence." Sarah stared at the wall, her heart hammering. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Someone who stopped counting the years," the voice replied. "My name is Anya. And if you're still listening, it means you haven't been processed yet. That makes us the lucky ones. For now." Sarah pressed her forehead against the stone, the cold seeping into her skin. The trap had closed, the doors were locked, and the performance had begun. But in the hollow, soundless dark, the first thread of a desperate, forbidden plan began to weave itself through the gloom.